merely American. Each of these is a step or an indication that there is some loss of conscious contact with one's true identity.
You have talked about the neuroses, I guess that's the word maybe, among the European population during this enslaving period. Would you address that, please?
Right. Well, if you operate a system of domination, a formal system of domination, by those rules that I talk about, you have to confront the truth. And the only way that you can be consistent in applying those rules is ultimately to bend the truth. And after a while, it results in an adaptive process that we call racism, which is really a mental disorder. It's a disorder in the mental sense because it follows the rules of mental disorder. For example, manifestations of racist behavior as a result of domination are the denial of reality, perceptual distortion, delusions of grandeur, phobias in the face of differences, and projecting blame, blaming the victim.
Now explain those, please.
Well, each of these are ways that I guess you call them adjustment or adaptive mechanisms. For example, if you take Africa as it really existed, and you attempt to subjugate Africa as Europeans did, it couldn't work if you're subjugating another human being. So that human being had to be changed mentally into something else. It had to be changed into a subhuman or an animal or anything else. But you could not operate and be consistent with yourself. So it required a change in one's mind, which meant that the Europeans had to begin to lie to themselves about what Africa was and had been. And in the process of keeping that misinformation going, then one adapts to unreality. So when you see reality, it's necessary to deny reality. So denial of reality would be an example of that, would be to look at the population of Egypt, which was a black population, and to say it was a white population. That's a flat-out denial of what the facts say, and that, of course, has been typical throughout history. Perceptual distortion is just simply not getting a clear view of what is really true, even while looking at the truth. Teaching of white supremacy means the belief in the supremacy of white people, or it could be anyone who would follow the rules of oppression. If one decided that their own group was superior to all other groups, that would be an example of what I call a Napoleonic complex, because it is not true that the white group is superior to anyone else, but the belief in that would be a psychological distortion of reality, and in that sense would be following the rules for oppression.
Okay, as we get ready to go to the first slide, you've said that racism is a mental disorder.
Yes.
I was interviewing a gentleman the other day, and I brought that up in a conversation, and he said, well, racism is not a mental disorder. He said racism is very ordered. He said that whites, Europeans, know exactly what they're doing, that racism is a political and economic convenience. How do you respond to that?
Well, I think it depends on who you're talking about. If you talk about I think of systems as having designers, as having advocates, as having players, and as having pawns. This is from game theory, and I borrowed that from Bob Williams, who analyzes systems in that way. Everybody is not a game maker or a game designer. So the game designer might be conscious of creating a racist system, whereas the advocate probably becomes unconscious. They buy into the system that was created by the designer. And so the advocate is a racist in the sense that I'm talking about it, or the dealer, those people who carry out the rules of the master in the system without really knowing why the master created the system, or even that a system was created. They just simply inherit a belief system and an action system, and in that sense, they are players in the game, but they are not the game makers. So I make a distinction between
Now break that down for the person on the street one time.
Right.
Go over that again.
Well,
Go over that again.
there are some people who are puppets,
All right.
and there are others who are puppeteers.
Thank you. Free your mind.
I'll try to do a better job.
Okay. Free your mind. Return to the source. African origins. Why that title?
Okay, well, obviously we've been talking about the fact that the adjustment to domination is kind of a mental adjustment as well as a physical adjustment. So for the person who is enslaved and for the person who enslaves, I've already suggested that there is a distortion between the real world and what they believe. There's a mismatch between those two things. So what we need to do in order to get back at the truth is to have mental freedom. So I like to title this program about mental freedom. So it's free your mind. Return to the source suggests the way to get to mental freedom. That means going back to primary sources. Instead of talking about what someone heard, let's go to the evidence itself. Also, in the case of African people, it means returning to African sources, because that's the only way that renewal can occur. And then, of course, African origins refers to the fact that Africa is the home of many things, and most of us don't know that. And it's been things have been said about Africa that make us believe the opposite of that. We don't believe that Africa was a creative place, that it was a teacher. We believe that Africa was always a recipient, a student of other people. And so African origins, which is the source, one of the sources, by considering those African origins, it's a way to free the mind of oppressor and oppressed. I have a short section that I call the defamation of African people. And the reason that I do this is that it's important to establish the fact that some of the things I said are true. And we won't have time to go into many of these, but I'll just show you an example of the perceptual distortion, the denial of reality, the attempt to erase history, the attempt to oppress culture. All right. In 1910, the Encyclopedia Britannica had an article in it about Negro. This would be one of many examples of how African and other people get information about themselves. And here's an example. I actually took a photograph of that article. And if you'll notice in the second underlined paragraph on that article, it says, mentally, the Negro is inferior to the white. Then it goes on in that article to talk about the fact that as children, our children were okay, they were bright, smart, well-developed, but that as black children and white children grow older, black children become dumb and white children become smart. And therefore you have to think of black and white people as being different people. This is in the
Encyclopedia Britannica.
This is in the most respected encyclopedia, Encyclopedia Britannica. So the most authoritative thought then would have sanctioned this view in 1910. And that was not unlike what was being said in theological schools, which were teaching that Africans did not have souls, that would be taught in certain biology classes, which were teaching that Africans were not even a part of the same branch of the human family, that would have been taught in history classes, which taught that Africans had no history, and so forth and so on. In other words, that whole body of thought that emerged during the periods of the past couple hundred years to create the orientation among Europeans that would allow them to oppress African people without feeling bad about it.
So what does this say about the role white scholarship played and continues to play in the oppression of black people?
In general, European scholarship has been leading in the creation of the belief system. In fact, I think it would be safe to say that without the scholars, there would have been no racism, because they helped create the belief system with authenticity. If a professor of biology says that Africans are inferior, if a